Imagine going to war with nothing but a bottle of magic water and a whole lot of faith. No rifles, no grenades, just a liquid said to turn bullets into raindrops. Now picture your enemy is the German Empire, armed to the teeth, humorless, and very much not in the business of being stopped by enchanted hydration. Welcome to the Maji Maji Rebellion, one of the most spiritually charged, tragically poetic, and wildly underestimated uprisings in African history. It happened in what is today Tanzania, back when it was German East Africa, between 1905 and 1907. And it wasn't just a rebellion, it was a movement, a prayer, a cry for freedom drenched in hope and blood. At the center of it all was a man named Kinjikitile Ngwale, also known as Bokero, who claimed to have been possessed by a spirit called Hongo. And as far as possession stories go, this one came with merchandise. He offered a sacred concoction called Maji, Swahili for water, that he claimed could make German bullets bounce off like spitballs off a stone wall. Armed with this spiritual armor and righteous indignation, thousands of Africans from more than 20 different ethnic groups rose up in what would become one of the earliest and most coordinated acts of anti-colonial resistance on the continent. For a moment, it worked. For a moment, the German Empire trembled. And then it retaliated like a toddler who just had their toy snatched, but with machine guns and a scorched earth policy. The Maji Maji Rebellion matters not just because of the body count, though, spoiler, it's horrifying, but because it was one of the first times a colonized people across tribal lines came together to say, no, we're not growing your cotton, we're not paying your taxes, we're not dying quietly. It was spiritual warfare turned political statement, a battle where belief went to war with bullets, and for a brief moment, it almost seemed like belief would win. Until it didn't. The Germans responded with the kind of cruelty that even Europe had to squint at and say, wait, did we go too far? When Europeans start questioning other Europeans about being too violent, you know something has gone horribly off script. But the story didn't end with defeat. Maji Maji left a legacy. It planted a seed of resistance that would grow slowly, quietly, underneath decades of oppression, until independence finally bloomed. It taught colonial powers that Africans weren't going to stay silent or compliant forever. It taught future generations of African leaders that unity was possible, even across ancient tribal boundaries. And it taught the rest of us that sometimes people will walk into gunfire if they believe strongly enough in their freedom and in their holy water. So buckle up, because this story has everything: prophetic visions, militant faith, colonial arrogance, a devastating death toll, and the eternal question: what happens when spiritual rebellion meets industrial warfare? The answer, as you'll see, is as haunting as it is heroic. Let's talk about the Maji Maji Rebellion, when faith fought firepower and history wept. If colonization were a party, the Germans showed up late, brought a clipboard instead of snacks, and immediately started reorganizing the furniture. By the time Germany turned its eyes to East Africa in the late 19th century, most of the continent had already been carved up by Britain, France, Belgium, and other European powers that thought borders should be drawn with a ruler and a complete disregard for human lives. Germany, feeling a little left out of the imperial buffet, scrambled for its slice of the colonial cake and landed on a region we now know as Tanzania. Back then, it was called German East Africa,
A title that sounds like it came from someone who was more excited about the map label than the people living there. But where Britain tried to pretend colonialism was about tea and civilizing the savages, Germany didn't even bother with the charade. Their version of empire was aggressive, mechanical, and deeply in love with rules. They treated their African colony less like a place full of human beings and more like a misbehaving spreadsheet. Their goal? Squeeze as much profit as possible from the land. And anyone standing in the way of efficiency could kindly get out of the way or be crushed by the administrative steamroller. One of their biggest projects was cotton. Cotton, in German eyes, was the path to economic glory. Why buy it from someone else when you could just force thousands of Africans to grow it for free on their own land? The Germans didn't negotiate, they didn't incentivize, they simply demanded. In entire regions, Africans were forced to grow cotton instead of food. Village leaders became middle managers in an imperial production line. If a local chief didn't cooperate, he was replaced. If a farmer didn't comply, he was whipped, jailed, or worse. You didn't get paid for your labor. You got the privilege of not being punished. And as if forced labor wasn't enough, the Germans piled on taxes. Because nothing says welcome to our empire like demanding money from people who never asked you to be there in the first place. The hut tax, the head tax, the whatever we decide tax. All of it was enforced by brutal, sometimes comically excessive military force. It wasn't uncommon for German officers to march into villages with rifles, demand money, and if it wasn't immediately available, beat people until it appeared. It was less a tax system and more a mobile extortion unit with uniforms. Now, let's pause for a moment and appreciate the sheer absurdity of German colonial governance. Imagine trying to enforce strict Prussian order in a place where life revolved around seasons, oral tradition, community consensus, and, crucially, not filling out paperwork. The Germans sent memos. The locals sent goats. The Germans wanted everything documented in triplicate. The locals wanted to know why the river spirits were angry. This wasn't just a clash of civilizations, it was a full-on administrative meltdown. The Germans brought filing cabinets to a bonfire. They introduced a fixed work week to people who had always worked with the rhythms of the sun and rain. They built railways to move goods, not people. They outlawed ceremonies they didn't understand. And when something didn't go according to plan, they didn't ask why, they just assumed someone wasn't following instructions. The result was resentment, simmering just below the surface everywhere. The Germans couldn't see it because it wasn't in the rule book.
And here's the kicker. Despite all their control, all their structures, and all their weapons, the Germans never fully understood the people they were ruling. They saw subjects, not citizens. They saw workers, not communities. They saw resistance as disobedience, not as a cry for dignity. And in their relentless push for order and productivity, they created the very chaos they feared. So let's do a quick recap of the mood in German East Africa circa 1905. People are being whipped into growing cotton they don't want, on land they can't eat from, to support an empire they didn't ask for. They're paying taxes they don't owe, to foreign rulers they've never seen, enforced by soldiers who speak a language they don't understand. Spiritual leaders are being sidelined, tribal structures dismantled, and anyone who resists gets a first-class beating or worse. Now enter the contradiction. While Germany saw its African colony as an economic machine waiting to be optimized, the people living there were, quietly,
and sometimes not so quietly, seething. This wasn't just about money or crops, it was about dignity, about freedom, about watching your land become a ledger and your children become statistics, about being told your gods were nonsense, your customs were backward, and your life was worth less than a bale of cotton. This is the tension that set the stage, the calm before the holy storm. A land where colonial bureaucrats tried to run the world like a train schedule, and the people, tired of being cogs in a brutal machine, were about to swap obedience for open rebellion. And this rebellion wouldn't come in the form of rifles or grenades. No, the resistance would arrive soaked in symbolism, armed with sacred water, and delivered by a man who claimed he had heard from the spirit world itself. The Germans didn't see it coming, not because it was secret, but because it didn't make sense in their rule book. How do you prepare for an army that believes it can't be killed? How do you fight a war when your enemies aren't just resisting, they believe they're invincible? The drumbeat was starting, the spreadsheets were shaking, and very soon, German East Africa would discover that the real power of a people doesn't come from guns or government, but from the moment they decide they've had enough. Before the Germans came with their rifles, rules, and cotton quotas, the land that would become German East Africa was a mosaic of cultures, languages, and spiritual traditions. This wasn't some empty wilderness waiting to be civilized. It was alive, complex, and, most importantly, functional in its own way. Over 120 ethnic groups lived across the region, from the Hihi and the Highlands to the Ngoni, the Yao, the Zaramo, and the Matumbi in the south. Each group had its own customs, leadership structures, spiritual practices, and deep-rooted relationship with the land and sky. These communities weren't just tribes, they were societies, with their own systems of governance, trade, conflict resolution, and storytelling. Their identities weren't defined by flags or borders, but by ancestors, seasons, and the invisible threads connecting them to the spirits of the land and sky.
Local leadership operated on trust and tradition. Elders led with the wisdom of age. Chiefs governed through consensus, not coercion. Spiritual leaders, diviners, herbalists, rainmakers, held revered positions. These were the people you turned to when the crops failed, when sickness spread, or when your goat went mysteriously missing. The sacred was woven into the everyday. People didn't just believe in spirits, they lived with them. The ancestors weren't past, they were present. Forests had guardians, rivers had moods. The world was not just physical, it was spiritual, and everything was connected. And into this richly textured world came the Germans, who, to put it mildly, did not vibe with it. They saw these belief systems as obstacles, superstition, backwardness, problems to be solved with Christian missions and military boots. Where there had been organic, community-based systems of living, the Germans introduced alien structures that ignored context entirely. Tribal chiefs were replaced with colonial appointees who often lacked legitimacy. Rituals were banned. Sacred groves were cleared. Churches popped up next to prisons. And all the while, the land itself was being transformed from a communal resource into a commodity to be exploited. Not for the people, but for Berlin. But here's the thing about colonial disruption. When you tear down a culture without understanding it, you don't destroy it. You just drive it underground, where it festers, mutates, and eventually fights back. Even as the Germans imposed their version of order, spiritual traditions didn't disappear. They adapted. They got quieter, more creative, more dangerous to empires. Because when bullets can't be matched with bullets, people reach for something older, something intangible. And in the case of German East Africa, that something was spiritual resistance. It started small, rumors, whispers, a prophecy here, a ritual there. People began to talk about signs, strange dreams, unusual weather, the return of forgotten spirits. Across communities, stories circulated that the ancestors were angry, that the land was rejecting the invaders, that something big was coming. In the south, particularly among the Matumbi and neighboring groups, there was growing talk of a coming cleansing, a spiritual reckoning. The cotton fields weren't just back-breaking labor, they were sacrilege. The taxes weren't just unjust, they were curses. Resistance wasn't just political, it was cosmic. Spiritual leaders who had been sidelined by colonial administrators quietly resumed their roles, not as healers this time, but as guides. The people didn't just want to fight, they wanted to fight with the ancestors on their side. They wanted justice not just from the Germans, but from the spirit world that had been insulted, ignored, and trampled by boots and bureaucracy. Even in submission, resistance was taking shape. Refusing to grow cotton was an act of defiance. Holding a band ceremony was rebellion. Believing in the old ways, in the ancestors, in the spirits, became an act of political courage.
And then came the whispers of a man in the south, a man who claimed he had been visited by a spirit named Hongo, a man who spoke of water that could protect people from bullets, a man who said the time had come to rise up, not just with weapons, but with faith. For many, this wasn't new information, it was confirmation. The revolution had already begun in the hearts of people long before it began in the fields. All it needed was a spark. The colonial disruption of life in German East Africa didn't just create resentment, it lit the fuse for a resistance that would transcend politics. This was going to be a rebellion unlike anything Europe had seen, one not built on military might, but on belief, not in guns, but in gods, not in conquest, but in cleansing. And as the drums began to beat and the Maji began to flow, it became clear the spiritual resistance was no longer just brewing, it was about to erupt. In every great uprising, there's a spark, someone who shows up with just the right mix of charisma, conviction, and unexplainable mystery to turn quiet frustration into roaring fire. For the Maji Maji Rebellion, that someone was Kinjikitile Ngwale, better known as Bokero. If this rebellion were a band, Bokero was the lead singer, spiritual director, and marketing department all rolled into one. He wasn't the military general, he wasn't a politician, he wasn't even from the dominant tribe, but what he did have was a voice people listened to, a message people believed in, and perhaps most importantly, a bottle of sacred water that came with a heavenly guarantee. Bullets would bounce off your body like pebbles off a pot. That's right, holy water as body armor. Coming soon to a village near you. According to legend, and in these kinds of stories, legend is about as close to truth as you'll get, Bokero received his divine revelation at a well. One moment he was an ordinary man, the next he was possessed by the spirit of Hongo, a powerful ancestral force that had come to deliver a message. The people must rise, the Germans were to be expelled, and they would do it not with swords, but with Maji, water imbued with spiritual power. Drink it, bathe in it, sprinkle it on your chest, and the enemy's bullets would dissolve into dust.
No need for guns, no need for fear, just faith, unity, and a revolutionary hydration strategy. Now, to a German bureaucrat, this probably sounded like lunacy, but to tens of thousands of oppressed, overtaxed, cotton-weary Africans, it was hope. Bokero's message spread like wildfire, not because it was convenient, but because it met people at the crossroads of suffering and belief. He didn't just tell them they could win, he told them their victory was divinely guaranteed. And here's where it gets truly remarkable. Over 20 different ethnic groups who had long histories of rivalry and mistrust laid aside their differences to follow him. Let's be clear, this wasn't a minor achievement. In a world without Twitter, radio, or even reliable postal service, Bokero somehow managed to build the 1905 version of a pan-ethnic resistance network. His message transcended tribe, language, and even region. Villagers came from miles away to hear him speak, to collect some of the sacred Maji, and to receive his blessing. Word of mouth became his algorithm. Testimonials were his SEO, and his followers weren't just listening, they were believing. People anointed themselves with Maji and walked directly into German gunfire with full confidence that their bodies would be impervious. And for the record, yes, some even danced while doing it. Now that's brand loyalty.
In today's world, Bokero would have had 1 million TikTok followers and a line of ethically sourced, spiritually charged skincare products. Hydrate your soul and your skin. He'd be holding webinars on bullet resistance, selling subscription boxes with prayer beads and custom water flasks, and live streaming rituals from sacred wells. But back then, he didn't need the internet. What he had was more powerful. Belief rooted in desperation, and desperation looking for a miracle. Bokero wasn't just a prophet, he was a symbol. His emergence gave form to the formless anger simmering across the colony. For years, people had been suffering in silence, watching their way of life dissolve under the weight of colonial brutality. But now, there was a leader, a voice, a vision, and most incredibly, a unifying myth. The Maji wasn't just water, it was hope in liquid form, a sacrament for the suffering, a potion for the powerless, and its power came not from chemistry, but from belief. Of course, even within the region, not everyone believed the Maji worked literally. Some saw it as symbolic, a ritual binding people together, making them brave enough to face certain death, because dying with dignity was better than living under tyranny. But for many, it was very real. Bokero had tapped into something ancient and deep, the fusion of faith and action. He wasn't teaching military strategy, he was stirring spiritual awakening. His rebellion wasn't built on logistics, it was built on conviction. And in the early stages, that conviction gave the people something even more valuable than bullets: courage. For the Germans, Bokero was a nuisance, then a curiosity, then a serious problem. But by the time they realized how powerful his movement had become, it was too late. Villages had already been converted into spiritual outposts. Elders were chanting resistance. Young men were ready to fight. And even those who had never met Bokero were speaking his words, trusting his vision, and walking into battle with bottles of Maji and fire in their eyes. And just like that, the rebellion had a face. Not a soldier's face, not a politician's face, but the face of a prophet with a message that could not be taxed, beaten, or regulated. Bokero didn't need an army. He had belief. And for a moment, that was more than enough. Of course, belief has its limits, and the Germans had machine guns. But we're not there yet. For now, the Maji was flowing. The people were rising, and Bokero had done what few before him had managed to do: unite the oppressed under a single spiritual banner. One man, one message, one bottle of water, and a rebellion unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Maji was flowing, and so were the people, by the thousands. Word of Bokero's sacred water spread across German East Africa like gospel at a revival meeting.
Villagers lined up to receive their portion of the magical mixture, often in ceremonious rituals that involved dancing, drumming, and fervent declarations of invincibility. This wasn't just a rebellion, it was a movement, a pilgrimage of the oppressed, fueled by faith, organized by oral tradition, and hydrated by hope. And the message was consistent and contagious: take this water and no German bullet can harm you. Spiritual armor in a bottle, a revolutionary's dream come true. Entire communities mobilized. Chiefs, once hesitant to defy colonial orders, now marched at the front of processions. Men, women, even teenagers pledged allegiance to the cause. Ethnic divisions that had once defined and divided the region melted away like mist under the morning sun. The Ngani, the Mantumbi, the Bena, the Yao, groups that had their own languages, histories, and beefs suddenly found themselves part of a single sacred uprising. They may have pronounced Maji slightly differently, but they all believed it did the same thing: turn bullets into water droplets and cowards into warriors. The Germans, of course, had no idea what was coming. After all, what could possibly go wrong when you run an empire through spreadsheets and strict punishments? When the first wave of coordinated attacks began in July 1905, the colonial government was stunned. The rebels targeted cotton fields first, fields they had been forced to toil in, torching them as an act of purification. Then they moved to outposts, where they attacked German soldiers and local collaborators with spears, machetes, and the unshakable belief that no harm could come to them. The first major assault was on the German garrison at Ifakara. The rebels overwhelmed the defenders. The station burned, German soldiers died, and the myth of Maji's power gained even more traction. To the Germans, this was absurd. How could these ragtag villagers, untrained, barefoot, and armed with what looked like gardening tools, be taking down armed posts? But they hadn't accounted for what happens when desperation meets conviction. These weren't just rebels, these were hydrated rebels. Rebels who believed they had divine endorsement and spiritual immunity. Rebels who sang as they charged, who painted themselves in war paint and poured Maji on their chests like holy warriors going into battle. If you were a German officer expecting another quiet day of colonizing, it was suddenly starting to feel like the forest had teeth. The rebellion wasn't just spreading, it was erupting. Within weeks, entire regions were in open revolt. Railway lines were sabotaged, telegraph wires were cut, government buildings were burned. Local colonial employees found themselves fleeing from the very people they once ordered around. German reinforcements, rushed from the coast, found themselves marching into terrain they barely understood, facing enemies who didn't fight like European armies and didn't seem afraid to die. And that was the terrifying brilliance of it all. The Maji gave people courage. Whether or not it worked as advertised, spoiler, it didn't, it made people believe they were protected. And belief is a potent weapon, maybe not against bullets, but certainly against fear. It's hard to suppress a rebellion when your enemy doesn't mind dying for their cause. The Germans didn't understand that kind of commitment. Their soldiers were conscripts and career men. The Maji Maji fighters were believers.
At the height of the rebellion, it wasn't uncommon to see scenes that would make any colonial officer reconsider their life choices. Lines of rebels, sometimes barefoot and shirtless, marching in rhythm, chanting songs of deliverance, pouring maji over each other and heading directly toward gunfire as if it were a spring drizzle. There were drums, there were spears, there were flags. One group purportedly went into battle with a gourd of sacred water in one hand and a handful of millet in the other, a reminder that this war was also about reclaiming the right to grow their own food. And despite their lack of modern weapons, the rebels had strategy. They attacked outposts simultaneously, disrupting supply lines and isolating colonial strongholds. They used their intimate knowledge of the land to evade capture, ambush patrols, and melt back into the forests. The Germans, with all their maps and railways, were suddenly on the back foot, reacting rather than commanding. For a brief moment, it seemed like the impossible was happening. The empire was losing to the people. But this wasn't just a military campaign. It was a spiritual awakening. Songs were written, chants were shared across regions, rituals were performed before battle. The rebellion became a national revival disguised as an insurrection. People didn't just want freedom, they wanted restoration. They wanted their gods, their land, their rhythms back. They weren't just fighting Germans, they were fighting for identity, for ancestors, for something they couldn't name but felt in their bones. Of course, the cracks would eventually show. Some maji didn't seem to be working as advertised. Not everyone who believed in bulletproof water stayed alive long enough to testify about it. But in the early months, those doubts were drowned out by the sheer momentum of the uprising. For every fighter who fell, two more rose in their place, maji in hand, ready to defy an empire. In Berlin, the news of the rebellion caused mild panic and major confusion. Why were so many Africans fighting? Who is this Bokero fellow? And what on earth was in that water? Back in the colony, the German administration scrambled to respond. Their orderly empire was slipping into chaos, and all their rifles, taxes, and rules couldn't seem to stop it. For a time, faith ruled the land. The drums of resistance echoed across the plains. The maji anointed the foreheads of the faithful, and the empire, cold, mechanical, and arrogant, was learning a hard truth. You can suppress people with force, but when they believe they are untouchable, you're not just facing a rebellion, you're facing a reckoning. And the reckoning had just begun. At some point, even the most passionate rebellion runs headfirst into reality. And for the Maji Maji movement, that reality came in the form of German counterattacks. Swift, brutal, and utterly indifferent to the spiritual confidence of their opponents. The early months of surprise and momentum gave way to the grim realization that belief, no matter how deeply held, could not stop bullets. The Maji, as sacred as it was, did not in fact turn German firepower into rainwater. And the Germans, no longer amused by this water war, decided to respond the only way empires know how, with overwhelming violence and a complete disregard for nuance.
At first, the Germans tried to contain the rebellion with small units and local forces, assuming this was just a passing disturbance stirred up by superstition. But when villages kept rising and railway stations kept burning, they adjusted their approach. And by adjusted, we mean they went full scorched earth. They brought in reinforcements from outside the colony, including Askaris, African soldiers fighting for Germany, and German officers who had clearly missed the memo about proportional response. They didn't just want to win, they wanted to erase the idea that resistance was possible. Villages that had harbored rebels were razed, fields were torched, livestock slaughtered, wells poisoned. The goal wasn't just to kill fighters, it was to starve the spirit out of the people. The Germans decided that if the rebels were fighting with faith, they'd fight back with fear. Entire regions were depopulated. Families who had nothing to do with the rebellion were punished just for living in the wrong district. Homes were burned not because they hid weapons, but because they might have heard a rebel song. And all the while, the myth of Maji began to unravel. On the battlefield, the Maji was proving tragically unreliable. People who had poured it on their chests were still falling, shot through by German bullets that had no respect for sacred liquids. Word began to spread that maybe the water didn't work after all, or maybe the spirits had changed their minds. Maybe the problem wasn't the water, but the faith of the user. Or maybe, as some began to whisper, the spirit Hongo had left them. Whatever the explanation, the result was the same. Bodies were piling up, and the once unstoppable rebellion was beginning to stall. The psychological blow was immense. Imagine walking into battle utterly convinced that you're invincible, only to watch your comrades collapse around you like dominoes in the dirt. What happens when the water dries up and the gunfire doesn't? For many, it was a crisis of both survival and belief. This was no longer just a political defeat, it was a spiritual heartbreak. The same faith that had united them was now being tested in the most excruciating way possible, by death that refused to be denied. To make matters worse, Bokero was already dead. The prophet, the spark of the movement, the man who had told everyone that freedom flowed from sacred wells, was captured early in the rebellion and executed by the Germans. Just like that. No trial, no martyrdom tour, just gone. His followers never got to hear a final sermon, never got a last blessing, never got a chance to look into the eyes of the man who had promised them protection. History has a cruel way of dealing with its visionaries. They often die before the second act even begins. Bokero's absence left a vacuum that no gourd of Maji could fill. And yet, even as the rebellion faltered, people kept fighting. Maybe out of momentum, maybe out of sheer rage, or maybe because, at that point, surrender felt more dangerous than resistance. After all, if the Germans were willing to burn your crops and kill your children for rising up, what might they do if you laid down your arms? At least rebellion gave you dignity. Surrender only guaranteed survival, and even that was a gamble.
As the months dragged on, the rebellion fractured. Some regions tried to hold the line, while others disbanded or fled into hiding. Hunger set in. Disease followed. The scorched earth policy, effective in its cruelty, worked. Crops failed, famine spread, and people began dying not from bullets, but from empty stomachs and poisoned wells. The Germans called this victory. History would later call it what it was, a massacre. And yet, despite the carnage, despite the failure of Maji to deliver bulletproof salvation, the legacy of what had been attempted lingered like smoke after a fire. The Maji may not have stopped bullets, but it had done something remarkable. It brought people together. It awakened something ancient and powerful. It made a colony of fragmented villages believe, even if just for a moment, that unity was possible, that freedom was worth fighting for, and that even in the face of absurd odds, they could rise. Still, there's a tragic irony in it all, that the very thing which had made the rebellion so electrifying was also the thing that made its end so brutal. You can almost imagine the bitter satire. Well, we tried to block bullets with vibes. Turns out bullets don't care about vibes. The Germans, with their order and gunpowder, had won the battle, but the spiritual force behind Maji Maji, that wild, defiant energy, was harder to kill. You can execute a prophet, but you can't execute the hunger for dignity. You can burn down a village, but you can't burn an idea. The rebellion was over, but the memory was not. And deep in the ashes of the scorched land, something was still smoldering. Something the Germans didn't see because it wasn't in their ledgers or maps. Something that would come back in time, not with Maji, but with marches, speeches, and the same unshakable desire to live free. But that's later. For now, the land was silent, the Maji had dried, and the bullets had done their work. The rebellion that started with sacred water ended in blood, and the world would never be the same. What followed the battlefield defeats was not a return to peace, but something far darker, the kind of chapter history books sometimes footnote as suppression, but which, in truth, deserves the label of calculated annihilation. The German Empire, humiliated by the audacity of the Maji Maji Rebellion and shaken by the fact that their mighty colonial machine had been embarrassed by spiritual nonsense, decided to respond in the only way colonizers seem to know when their authority is threatened, by turning vengeance into policy. The German strategy shifted dramatically after the initial phase of the rebellion. It was no longer about simply defeating rebel forces in combat. No, now it was about erasing the very possibility of rebellion. The thinking was clear. If you can't kill an idea, you kill everything around it until the soil itself forgets. So the Germans embraced a brutal, scorched earth campaign. Entire regions were systematically depopulated, not just through bullets, but through famine, thirst, and fear.
They didn't just burn rebel hideouts, they torched entire villages, whether they had supported the resistance or not. Fields of cassava, maize, millet, gone. Granaries were looted or set ablaze, wells were poisoned or destroyed, livestock was slaughtered en masse, not for food, but to starve those who remained. Rivers ran with ash, skies blackened with smoke, and the land that once pulsed with communal life became a graveyard in waiting. It was starvation by design, a slow death. The kind of cruelty that doesn't scream in headlines, but whispers through the cries of hungry children and the silence of fields that will never be planted again. The Germans understood that bullets could break bodies, but hunger could break entire communities. It is a deeply chilling thing when a government uses famine as a weapon. And yet that's exactly what the Germans did, with spreadsheets in one hand and torches in the other. Estimates vary, but historians now agree that over 250,000 people died, not from battle, but from the consequences of this colonial revenge campaign. 250,000 lives gone. Most were civilians. Many were children. Some were people who had never lifted a weapon or poured Maji over their skin. Their crime? Living in the wrong place. Breathing in a region where resistance once dared to rise. And yet, as bodies piled up and villages vanished, the German administration continued to pat itself on the back. Colonial officials wrote gleaming reports to Berlin about restoring order,
about civilizing the natives, about the success of their anti-insurgency strategy. The same mouths that ordered the burning of crops were now proclaiming the virtues of German discipline and governance. In their eyes, they had saved East Africa from chaos. In reality, they had turned it into a killing field. This disconnect between reality and rhetoric is one of colonialism's cruelest habits, the ability to dress genocide in the language of progress. One German official, Theodor Lutwein, would later claim that such harsh measures were necessary to teach Africans respect for authority. Others praised Governor Gustav Adolf von Goetzen for stabilizing the region. Stabilized? Let's be clear, East Africa was not stabilized. It was scorched, starved, and silenced. The only thing stable was the stench of death hovering over the land. The justifications only get more absurd. German propaganda at the time painted the campaign as a noble act of civilization. Their mission, they said, was to bring roads, schools, and law to a disordered people. And yet, when you look around, the evidence of that so-called progress looked less like education and more like execution. We brought civilization, they declared, while standing knee-deep in ashes and bones. There's something deeply grotesque in the idea of European powers claiming moral superiority while simultaneously overseeing mass death. It's the same logic that built empires on coffins and then erected statues to the men who filled them. Civilization for the Germans in Tanganyika meant obedience. And when the people refused to obey, they were no longer seen as human beings. They became obstacles to be removed.
And so the brutality intensified. Entire zones were designated as free fire areas, meaning anyone seen could be shot on sight. Entire tribes were labeled as enemies. Survivors fled into forests, into mountains, into places where hunger was inevitable and safety a myth. Disease followed, as it always does when people are forced to live like ghosts. Smallpox, dysentery, and typhoid swept through the displaced. Children died clutching dried roots, hoping to eat. Mothers wrapped their babies in torn rags, praying for rain that wouldn't come. And yet, amidst this horror, the people remembered. They remembered the promise of Bokero, the unity of the early rebellion, the sacredness of the Maji. Not because it had saved them, but because it had meant something. Something more than German railroads or military boots. Something that spoke to dignity, to hope. The Maji may have failed to stop bullets, but it had succeeded in giving the people a story, one that was theirs. That story, passed down in whispers and songs, would long outlive the German Empire. And it would not forget. It would speak of how belief can inspire courage, but also how power, unchecked, unfeeling, and unapologetic, can wipe out entire generations. The Maji Maji Rebellion wasn't just crushed, it was buried, and not metaphorically. Entire communities were reduced to memories, languages lost, cultures disrupted, all in the name of order. And still, Germany's East African rule continued, bureaucratic and brutal as ever, until they eventually lost the colony during World War I. But by then, the damage had been done. The land remembered.
The rivers knew. The ancestors carried the weight. And for decades afterward, as other African nations rose up against colonial powers, the ghost of Maji Maji hovered, not as a warning, but as a war cry. Because once you've seen what faith can do, even when it fails, you never forget. And once you've seen what empires are capable of, especially when they win, you never forgive. News of the horror eventually leaked. It always does. Despite the Germans' attempts to control the narrative with sanitized reports, self-congratulatory dispatches, and euphemisms like reasserting control or restoring order, the sheer scale of the devastation in East Africa couldn't stay buried forever. Whispers turned into rumors, and rumors became headlines. European journalists, missionaries, and diplomats stationed in or near the colony began sending back letters, many horrified, some aghast, and a few brave enough to say plainly what was happening. Genocide, dressed up as governance. As the details trickled into European newspapers, a storm began to brew, not in the German colonies, but in the drawing rooms in coffee houses of Berlin, London, and Paris. The German public, still riding the nationalistic wave of empire building, suddenly had to reconcile their pride in colonial expansion with images of scorched villages and mass starvation. Some did mental gymnastics to justify it. The Africans brought it on themselves. Others, however, couldn't ignore the gut-wrenching reality. The so-called civilizing mission was looking more like an extermination campaign.
German newspapers initially parroted the government line, praising Governor von Goetzen and his administration for their firmness in the face of native fanaticism. But as foreign outlets began publishing more graphic accounts of mass graves, of children dying from hunger, of entire ethnic groups on the brink of extinction, the pressure mounted. The German Reichstag, Parliament, found itself facing a public relations crisis of imperial proportions. Debates flared. Politicians demanded inquiries. Humanitarian societies, often religious or Quaker in origin, launched campaigns to expose the abuses. Some called it Germany's version of the Congo Free State scandal. Of course, these protests were not purely altruistic. For many in Europe, the shock was less about African suffering and more about imperial embarrassment. After all, no empire wants to look too barbaric. That defeats the whole "we're bringing light to the dark places" narrative. Civilization, they said, should come with railroads, churches, and maybe the occasional public hanging. But not mass starvation. Not 250,000 dead. That made even the most ardent colonizer shift uncomfortably in their leather chair. And so, under mounting international and domestic scrutiny, the German colonial administration began to adjust. Not reform, not apologize, just tweak. They replaced a few of the more brutal officers, revised some tax policies, and started speaking in the softer tones of development and partnership. But on the ground in East Africa, little truly changed. The same systems of control remained, the same extraction of labor, the same disregard for African autonomy, the same quiet violence, only now it was better packaged for European consumption. Germany's colonial PR machine learned a valuable lesson. If you're going to run an empire, make sure to keep the cruelty efficient, subtle, and, above all, off the front page. Gone were the overt scorched earth campaigns, but the fundamental ethos of domination persisted. Africans were still subjects, not citizens.
Their lands, labor, and lives still belonged to the Reich. Meanwhile, the Maji Maji Rebellion faded from the headlines. Europe moved on, as it always does. There were other colonies, other uprisings, other tragedies to obsess over. But something had shifted, if only slightly. The myth of the pure, benevolent empire, the glowing promise of the white man's burden, had taken a hit. Not a fatal one, but a visible bruise. The Maji Maji uprising had punctured the facade. For a brief moment, the world had glimpsed the true cost of empire, not in gold or maps, but in blood. And in some corners of Germany, especially among younger intellectuals and progressives, there were murmurs of doubt. Was the colonial project truly noble? Was spreading order worth this kind of horror? These questions didn't topple the system, but they seeded a quiet reckoning, one that would simmer beneath the surface of German political life for decades. In time, they would shape how Germany approached its post-colonial legacy, or avoided it.
Still, even as Europe wrung its hands and signed petitions, the people of Tanganyika were left to pick up the pieces. Fields had to be replanted, graves dug, memories buried yet carried. The shockwaves of Maji Maji didn't just reach Berlin, they echoed for generations through African soil. But in the drawing rooms of Europe, the crisis became a conversation. In East Africa, it had been a cataclysm. Today, when Tanzanians talk about their history, their real history, not the one handed down in colonial textbooks, the Maji Maji Rebellion sits at the center like an ancestral heartbeat. It's not just an event tucked away in the early 1900s. It's a symbol, a memory, a wound, and a badge of honor. The rebellion might not have succeeded in the conventional sense. No colonial government was overthrown, no treaties rewritten, no independence declared. But ask any student of African resistance what Maji Maji meant, and you'll hear words like unity, sacrifice, faith, and defiance. Words that would echo all the way into the 20th century's great liberation movements. In the decades that followed, as Germany lost its colonies after World War I and Britain took over Tanganyika, the story of Maji Maji didn't disappear. In fact, it became more powerful because now it belonged to the people. Passed down through oral history, taught in hushed tones by grandparents who had witnessed it, and retold by leaders who needed their people to remember. We resisted once before, and we will again. It was especially potent because of how rare it was. The idea that over 20 different ethnic groups with different languages, customs, and histories could unite, even briefly, under one cause? That was historic, revolutionary. In an age when colonialism relied on dividing people, sowing mistrust between tribes, and rewarding informants, the Maji Maji movement dared to imagine unity. Kinjekitile Bokero may have died early in the uprising, but his message lived on like a spiritual software update no colonial administrator could uninstall. And the symbolism of the water, Maji, endured too, not as a failed protection spell, but as a metaphor for belief, for the power of spirit, for the way people can put their faith in something bigger than themselves, even when the odds are absurdly stacked against them. Later leaders, like Julius Nyerere, Tanzania's first president and one of Africa's most respected independence figures, would look to Maji Maji as proof that resistance was not only possible, but inevitable. Colonialism was not a permanent structure, it was a storm, terrible, violent, but passable. The ancestors had already shown the way. During Tanzania's struggle for independence in the 1950s and 1960s, nationalist movements like TANU Tanganyika African National Union didn't just fight with speeches and negotiations, they fought with stories. Stories of their people rising up, stories that inspired courage and identity. And one of the biggest, boldest stories in that arsenal was Maji Maji. It proved to young Tanzanians that colonial authority was not sacred, not untouchable. It had been challenged before, and though that challenge ended in tragedy, it left a blueprint. A spiritual one, yes, but a political one too.
Empires time and again make the same mistake. They think human beings can be governed solely through fear and force. That if you tax hard enough, punish harshly enough, silence ruthlessly enough, people will stay obedient. But history, especially the history of colonized peoples, tells a different story. It tells of the moment when fear turns into fury, when submission turns into defiance, when the people who once bowed down begin to rise, fueled not by military training or superior firepower, but by the sheer refusal to die quietly. The Germans thought they were managing a colony. What they encountered was a spiritual revolt they couldn't quantify or predict. They underestimated the human spirit until it was too late, until it bled out in the fields they burned, the rivers they poisoned, and the villages they starved. Maji Maji also warns us that desperation and hope are a volatile mix. Desperation on its own is quiet. It cries in the dark, suffers silently. But when you add hope to it, even the slimmest thread, suddenly people start moving. They gather, they chant, they dream. And sometimes, tragically, they charge into a future they aren't prepared for. That's what makes the Maji Maji Rebellion so deeply moving and so devastating. It was both revolution and tragedy. A people reached for liberation and found death. But in that death, they planted seeds that would sprout into independence decades later. That's the complicated, beautiful, and painful alchemy of resistance. So what does it teach us now? That courage matters, that faith can move mountains, or at least convince people they can, that unity, even if short-lived, is one of the most dangerous and beautiful weapons the oppressed can wield. And maybe, just maybe, it also teaches us to prepare better. Because while spiritual conviction is powerful, it works best when paired with a plan. And let's be honest, a little tactical armor wouldn't hurt either. So the next time someone invites you to join a movement with promises of magical water that stops bullets, it's okay to believe. Just make sure you ask for a helmet too. Maybe even a strategy meeting. Because faith may be enough to start a rebellion, but wisdom is what helps you survive it.